There are towns that run people out with pitchforks and shouting, and there are towns that do it quietly, with a signed decree and a closed door, and Wren Calloway had the misfortune of being cast out of Thorn's Landing by the second kind. She left with the clothes on her back, a dog named Duke who would not be parted from her, and $3 silver sewn into her hem, every cent she had left after 2 years of being called a thief's daughter for a crime her father never committed. She walked 11 days through Montana Territory before she found Wolf Creek, a rough little outpost at the edge of the fur country, just in time for the county to auction off the abandoned lodge of a trapper who died alone and half-mad, or so the story went, muttering about proof nobody ever believed. $3 bought her the lodge, its leaking roof, and a dead man's reputation for madness that half of Wolf Creek seemed eager to hang on her too. They called her a fool for spending her last coin on a dead man's ruin, instead of a room at the boarding house. They did not yet know her dog had already found the one wall in that lodge that mattered. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Wren Calloway and her faithful dog, Duke. If you've ever been cast out by people who should have stood by you, or found the truth waiting in a place everyone else called worthless, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear where your own hidden proof was waiting. We should tell you first how a clerk's daughter came to be walked out of a company town with nothing but a dog and $3, because the wrong done to Wren Calloway did not happen all at once, and it did not happen by accident. Thorn's Landing belonged, in every way a town can belong to one man, to Elias Thorn, owner of the Thorn Fur and Trading Company, the largest fur concern in that stretch of the territory, and a man who had built his fortune the way ambitious men so often do, by convincing everyone around him that his interests and theirs were exactly the same. Wren's father, Silas Calloway, had been Thorn's chief bookkeeper for 14 years, a careful, precise man, who took genuine pride in a ledger that balanced to the penny, and who had raised his daughter, after her mother's early death, with the same quiet devotion he brought to his columns of figures, teaching her to read a balance sheet before she was 10, to spot a miscounted trapline tally at a glance, to believe, above all else, that honest numbers told an honest story if a person was patient enough to listen. It was that very patience that undid him. In the spring of Wren's 17th year, Silas began noticing discrepancies in the company's dealings with the independent trappers and the Métis and Cree families who supplied a third of Thorn's furs. Prices quietly recorded higher on paper than what was actually paid out at the trading counter. The difference vanishing into accounts Silas didn't recognize and couldn't trace, no matter how carefully he followed the numbers. He said nothing to Thorn at first, being a cautious man by nature, choosing instead to gather proof the way he'd always done everything, slowly, meticulously, certain that the truth, once fully assembled, would speak for itself. He did not yet understand that some men do not fear the truth so much as they fear who might be holding it when it finally speaks. Silas Calloway was arrested on a charge of embezzlement 8 months later, on evidence that Wren would spend years insisting had been placed rather than found. Company funds discovered, conveniently, in a strongbox under his own porch. Funds that matched almost exactly the sum he had been quietly documenting as missing from the trapper accounts. Elias Thorn stood before the whole town at the hearing, grave and sorrowful, and spoke of his trusted clerk's betrayal with a performance of grief so convincing that even Wren, sitting frozen in the gallery at not yet 18 years old, felt for one terrible moment that she might be watching a stranger, rather than the father she'd known her whole life. She remembered every detail of that hearing with the sharp, unwelcome clarity grief sometimes leaves behind. The courtroom had smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, packed shoulder to shoulder with company men who owed their livelihoods to Thorn, and could not have afforded, even had they wished to, the luxury of doubting him aloud. Her father sat very still at the defendant's table the whole proceeding, his hands folded in the same careful, patient way he folded them over his ledgers each evening, and Wren would later come to understand that his stillness that day had not been the stillness of guilt, but of a man watching, with growing horror, exactly how completely he had misjudged the danger of the truth he'd been chasing. He caught her eye only once, near the hearing's end, and mouthed 3 words she would carry with her the rest of her life: "I did nothing." She believed him then. She would spend the better part of a decade proving she'd been right to. Silas Calloway died in the territorial jail 11 months later, officially of a lung fever that swept the cells that winter, though Wren would always believe the fever had simply finished what 2 years of despair and public disgrace had already begun. Here is the bigger truth we promised to bring you to, the one that would take Wren nearly a decade to fully uncover. Her father had not been wrong about the missing money, and he had not been careless in how he searched for it. He had simply made the mistake of trusting that Elias Thorne, when finally confronted with proof of his own fraud, would behave like an honest man caught rather than a powerful one cornered. And it was that single miscalculation, not any failure of character, that cost him everything. Wren herself did not escape the Calloway name's ruin. Thorne, having disposed of the father, found the daughter's continued presence in his company town an inconvenience he preferred not to explain to newer arrivals unfamiliar with the story, and 2 years after her father's death, on the quiet authority of a company that owned every building in Thorne's Landing, including the one she'd grown up in, she was given 30 days to vacate the only home she had ever known. Nobody in town spoke openly against the decree. A handful of women, who had once shared coffee with her mother, left baskets on her step, the week before she left. The same careful, guilty kindness of people who knew an injustice was happening, and had already decided not to be the ones to stop it. She packed what little she could carry, took the dog, a rust-brown mutt with a torn ear named Duke, given to her by her father the same spring the discrepancies first appeared, as though some part of him had known, even then, that his daughter might need a loyal thing to hold onto before long, and walked out of Thorne's Landing with her chin level and her eyes dry, refusing to give the town the satisfaction of watching her weep. She would tell you now, if you asked her, that the 11 days of walking that followed were not even the hardest part of that year. The hardest part was the quiet, corrosive doubt that crept in somewhere around the 6th night, camped beside a cold fire with Duke curled tight against her side for warmth, wondering whether the whole territory might be right about her father after all. Whether she had simply loved a guilty man too much to see him clearly. It was Duke, oddly enough, who kept that doubt from swallowing her whole. His steady, unbothered loyalty, a kind of argument all its own. Because a dog, she reasoned on the worst of those cold nights, does not stay faithful to a family built on a lie. He had loved her father without reservation his whole short life, and he loved her still, and something in that simple, uncomplicated devotion held her together on nights when her own convictions felt too fragile to trust. There were practical hardships enough to occupy her waking hours, besides the doubt: a pair of boots that gave out entirely on the 9th day, mended with strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat, a stretch of open prairie where the only water she found for 2 full days came from a stock tank shared grudgingly with someone else's cattle. A night so cold that she and Duke slept pressed together beneath every scrap of clothing she owned, and still woke shivering before dawn. She did not complain of any of it, not even to herself, because complaint felt like a luxury reserved for people who still had somewhere soft to land, and she was no longer entirely sure she did. What she had, instead, was a direction: west, away from Thorne's Landing and everything it had taken from her, and a dog who trotted that direction at her side, without once looking back toward the town that had cast them both out, as though he'd already decided, long before she had, that there was nothing behind them worth the looking. Wolf Creek was not much of a town when Wren Calloway walked into it on the 11th day. A scatter of log buildings around a trading post and a courthouse too grand for the population it served, set at the far edge of Thorne's own trapping territory, close enough to the mountains that the fur trade still ran the local economy, but far enough from Thorne's Landing itself that nobody there recognized her name. She arrived with her feet blistered through her boots, and her $3 sewn-in still, miraculously, intact, on the very morning the county was auctioning off what remained of a dead trapper's estate. A low log lodge, 2 miles up Wolf Creek's North Fork, abandoned for going on a year since old Amos Kettle had been found dead in his own bed by a passing supply runner, alone, with no family anyone could locate and a reputation, by every account Wren overheard standing at the edge of that auction crowd, for having gone thoroughly strange in his final seasons, muttering to anyone who'd listen about proof he meant to bring forward, and never did. Nobody wanted Kettle's lodge. It had sat 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, through a hard winter, with no one to patch its roof, and the auctioneer, we should tell you, nearly skipped the lot entirely, joking that the county would likely have to pay someone to haul the ruin down before it collapsed on its own. But Duke, sitting at Wren's heel through the whole dispiriting morning, had gone suddenly, sharply alert at the mention of it, ears up, torn one included, a low whine rising in his throat that Wren had not heard from him since the last week before her father's arrest, when he'd paced the porch for 3 straight nights, as though some trouble were already on its way that only he could smell coming. She had $3 and nowhere else in the world she was expected. The lodge went for exactly that. The walk up Wolf Creek's North Fork took the better part of an hour. Duke ranging ahead the whole way with the same restless purpose he'd shown at the auction. Circling back to check on her only long enough to be sure she was still following before racing forward again. The lodge itself, when it finally came into view through a stand of lodgepole pine, was smaller and more weathered than even the auctioneer's grim description had prepared her for. A single low room of hand-hewn logs, gone silver with age. A stone chimney leaning half a foot off true, a door that hung crooked on leather hinges, gone stiff as old boot leather. The smell that met her on the porch was thick with the particular perfume of a trapper's abandoned life. Old pine pitch, and wood smoke soaked so deep into the timbers, it seemed part of the wood's own grain. The faint musty sweetness of cured hides long since sold or rotted away, and underneath it all, cold and mineral, the smell of a hearth that had gone 15 months without a fire. We won't pretend Wren felt anything but doubt, standing in that doorway with the weight of her last $3 gone, and a roof over her head that looked likely to come down in the next hard snow. But Duke felt something entirely different. He crossed the single room in 4 quick strides, straight to the lodge's north wall, and began scratching. Hard, urgent, insistent scratching at the base of the logs, whining in a way that was not curiosity, but something closer to distress, as though the wall itself held some old grief he couldn't simply walk away from. Duke, what is it, boy? She crossed the room and knelt beside him, running her hand along the logs where he scratched, and it was only by candlelight, later that evening, that she noticed what her eyes had missed in the fading afternoon light. A section of the walls chinking, the mud and moss mortar packed between the logs, that was a different color than the rest, grayer, more recently disturbed, patched by a hand less practiced than whoever had built the original wall. Someone, and not too many months before his death, had opened that wall and closed it again. We should tell you now, because it is the kind of discovery that changes the whole shape of the days that follow, that what lay hidden behind Amos Kettle's north wall would, within a month, tear open a wound that had been quietly poisoning the fur country for the better part of 2 decades. But that first evening, working a rusted hunting knife into the packed chinking with Duke pressed anxious against her side, whining low and steady with every board she pried loose, Wren Calloway knew only that a dead man's madness had just begun to look a great deal more like a dead man's desperate honesty. The cavity behind the wall was shallow but carefully built, lined with oiled canvas gone brittle with age, and inside it, Wren found a stack of ledgers, 6 of them, bound in cracked leather, each one filled cover to cover with the same careful, obsessive handwriting, dates running back nearly 20 years. It took her most of that first night, reading by a fire she'd finally managed to coax from damp kindling, Duke's head heavy and watchful across her lap the entire time, to understand what she was holding, and when understanding finally came, it arrived with a force that left her hands shaking too badly to turn the pages. The early ledgers read, at first, like nothing more than an unusually thorough fur buyer's private accounts. Columns of dates, trapping families' names, pelt counts, prices offered, and prices recorded. The same disciplined precision Wren recognized instantly from her own father's books, as though the habit of careful arithmetic were some shared language between men who valued honesty above almost everything else. It was only in comparing the columns side by side, tracing the small, deliberate gap between the price a family was told they'd received and the higher price entered later in a second, more private set of figures, that the pattern began to surface. Slow and damning, page after page, year after year. The same quiet theft repeated against family after family, who had no way of knowing they were being cheated, and no power to challenge a company that controlled every scale and every trading counter for 80 miles in any direction. Amos Kettle had not always been a hermit trapper on Wolf Creek's North Fork. 20 years before, the ledgers revealed, he had worked as an independent fur buyer, contracted to the Thorn Company, traveling among the Métis and Cree trapping families, to record and pay out for pelts before the furs ever reached the company's central ledgers, and it was Kettle, not her father, who had first discovered the very fraud Silas Calloway later died trying to prove. Kettle's own careful notes described watching Elias Thorne, then still a young and ambitious company man himself, systematically underpay trapping families for their furs, while recording the full fair price in the company's own books, pocketing the difference over years until it amounted to a fortune, and described, too, in an entry dated the same autumn Wren's father first began noticing discrepancies of his own, a conversation in which Thorne had made it unmistakably clear what would happen to any employee who spoke of what they'd seen. Kettle had not been brave enough to speak, not then. He had taken instead what he told himself was the safer, quieter path. Resigning his position, retreating to the isolation of the North Fork, and spending the next 2 decades keeping his silent, guilty record of everything he knew, promising himself, year after year, that he would come forward eventually, that there would be a right moment, a safe moment, that never quite seemed to arrive. It was only in the ledger's final pages, written in a hand grown shaky with age and illness, that Wren found the words that broke her heart clean through, an entry, dated less than a year before Kettle's death, in which the old trapper wrote of hearing, second hand, months late, the way news travels slow to a hermit's cabin, of a Thorne's Landing bookkeeper named Calloway who had died in the territorial jail after being accused of the very embezzlement Kettle himself had watched Thorne commit 2 decades before. I let a good man die silent for my own silence. The entry read, in words Wren would carry with her the rest of her life. I am too old, and too much a coward now to undo it in the courts. But I will not let the truth die with me in this cabin. Whoever finds this, finish what I could not. Duke, through all of it, had not once left her side, his low, mournful whining, rising and falling with the rhythm of her own breath as she read, pressing closer whenever her hands began to shake, as though he understood, in whatever wordless way dogs understand such things, that the woman beside him had just been handed both a father's vindication and a stranger's decades-late confession in the very same breath. When at last she set the final ledger down and wept, the first real tears she'd allowed herself since walking out of Thorne's Landing 2 years before, Duke climbed fully into her lap, despite being far too large for it, and simply stayed there until the shaking finally passed. Word travels slower in fur country than it does in a settled town, but it does still travel, and it was not more than 3 weeks before news reached Elias Thorne, now a regional power broker with his eye on a territorial council seat, a man who had spent 20 years quietly assuming his sins had gone safely to the grave with a frightened old trapper, that a young woman calling herself Calloway had bought Amos Kettle's abandoned lodge on Wolf Creek, and was said to be asking careful, pointed questions around the settlement about the old fur buyer's final years. He came to Wolf Creek himself, which told Wren, before he'd said a single word, exactly how seriously he took the danger she posed. He found her on the lodge's crooked porch, mending a section of roof, and he came bearing, as men like Thorn so often do, an offer wrapped in reasonable, regretful language. A generous sum, more money than she'd seen since before her father's arrest, for the lodge, its contents, and her agreement to let old painful history rest where it belongs, for both our sakes. Duke would not come near him. The dog placed himself squarely between Thorn's polished boots and the lodge's front door, hackles raised the full length of his spine, a low and continuous growl rolling out of him unlike anything Wren had heard from him before. Not the whine of grief he'd shown at the wall, not the eager curiosity of discovery, but something colder and more certain. The sound, she thought, of an animal recognizing a danger his own instincts had been warning him about since the moment they'd first arrived in this valley. "That's quite an animal you've got," Thorn said, his easy smile flickering for just a moment at its edges. "Poorly trained, though, snarling at a man come to do you a kindness. He has good judgment about which men mean kindness, and which means something else," Wren answered, and did not move from the doorway Duke had already chosen to guard. Thorn studied her a long moment, the pleasant mask of his expression settling back into place with practiced ease, and when he finally turned to go, he paused at the porch steps to add, almost gently, that a woman alone in a place like this ought to think carefully about what old grudges were truly worth to her. She did not answer that at all. She only watched him ride away, one hand resting steady on the ruff of Duke's neck, and understood, with a clarity that startled her, that she was no longer half so afraid of him as she had been of his memory for the better part of a decade. Thorn did not accept her refusal gracefully. Within the month, he had used his influence with the Territorial Land Office to file a challenge against the validity of the county's original auction of Kettle's estate, arguing through a hired attorney that the land in question sat within an old, disputed boundary of Thorn Company holdings. A legal maneuver Wren recognized immediately as nothing more than the same patient, paper-thin cruelty that had once buried her father, aimed now at burying the ledgers before anyone outside Wolf Creek ever learned they existed. When that maneuver stalled in the slow grind of territorial courts, subtler pressure followed. The Wolf Creek trading post suddenly found its Thorn Company credit called in early. The local land agent grew strangely reluctant to record Wren's deed at all, and one gray morning she woke to find her woodpile scattered, and her porch door standing open, though nothing inside had been taken and nothing Duke's steady, satisfied posture at the threshold seemed to suggest had gotten past him long enough to try. She rode the 2 miles into Wolf Creek proper more often in those tense weeks than she had in the whole month before, wary of leaving the ledgers unguarded for long, and it was on one such ride that she finally understood just how far Thorn's reach into the settlement extended. The trading post clerk who had once greeted her warmly now suddenly too busy to meet her eye. A boarding house keeper who found her room unexpectedly unavailable, the very week she'd inquired about it. Small, deniable acts of pressure meant to remind her, without ever once being spoken aloud, exactly how much a man like Thorn could still make life difficult for a woman with no name left to protect her. She rode home each time to find Duke waiting at the lodge's edge, exactly where she'd left him, and took what comfort she could in the fact that whatever else Thorn's influence could reach, it had not yet managed to reach the one wall her dog still refused, every single evening, to stop sleeping directly beside. Here is the last piece of the bigger truth we promised you. Thorn's fear was not merely of exposure, but of pattern, because Amos Kettle's ledgers, once properly examined, did not describe a single act of fraud against a single family. They described a system, refined and repeated for 20 years across dozens of trapping families, Cree and Métis, and independent alike, each one quietly cheated of a fair price, while Thorn's fortune and reputation both grew on the strength of furs he'd never fully paid for. It would take the whole valley gathered in one room, and Duke's own steady, unshakable instinct one final time, to finally bring that entire pattern into the light, where it could no longer be denied. The Territorial Council hearing was called for the first Saturday of December, held at the Wolf Creek Courthouse, that had always seemed too grand for so small a settlement, and by the time Wren arrived, Duke at her heel, Kettle's 6 ledgers packed carefully in a trunk behind her, the room was already full to its walls with trappers and traders from up and down the valley, drawn by word that had finally, unstoppably, gotten out. Thorne arrived with 2 attorneys, and a story polished smooth by 20 years of practice. The ledgers, he told the assembled council, with grave, wounded dignity, were the ramblings of a man everyone in the territory already knew to have died half out of his mind. And it was, he suggested, a particular cruelty, that the daughter of a proven embezzler should now be trying to resurrect old slander against an honest company to salvage her own family's disgraced name. It might have worked, too, on a council inclined to trust a wealthy, respected man over a stranger with a dead trapper's diary. Except that Wren had spent the 3 weeks since Thorne's visit, doing exactly what her father would have done in her place. Writing 2 full days to the Territorial Archive, with a meticulous company auditor named Harlan Boyd. Unaffiliated with Thorne, and unbribable by reputation, who had cross-referenced every disputed price in Kettle's ledgers against the Thorne Company's own surviving trapline records, and found them to match with a precision that left no honest room for doubt. It was not the ledgers alone, though, that finally turned the room. It was Duke. As Thorne's attorney rose to dismiss the whole matter as a dead madman's fiction, Duke, who had sat quiet and watchful at Wren's feet through the whole proceeding, rose without any command at all, walked the length of the courthouse aisle, and sat himself directly in front of Elias Thorne, staring up at him with the same low, unbroken growl he had given him on the lodge's porch weeks before, a sound the whole silent room could hear. He did not lunge, and he was never for one moment in any danger himself. But there was something in the sight of that steady, unflinching dog, fixed without wavering on the one man in the room everyone had spent 20 years too frightened to look at directly, that seemed to loosen every careful tongue at once. An old Métis trapper named Baptiste Lafleur stood first, admitting in halting, furious English that his own father had been paid 1/3 of the recorded price for a decade of prime beaver pelts, and had never once dared complain to a company that owned the only trading post for 80 miles. Then a Cree woman named Amelia Whitecloud, then 2 more independent trappers, each testimony matching the pattern in Kettle's ledgers almost line for line. 20 years of careful, frightened silence broke apart across that courtroom in a single afternoon, the way a dam breaks all at once after holding steady far too long. Faced with Boyd's certified audit, Kettle's 20 years of documentation, and a room full of witnesses no longer willing to stay quiet, Elias Thorne's practiced composure finally failed him. The Territorial Council ordered a full investigation into 2 decades of Thorne Company trading records, and it did not take the investigators long, once real evidence was finally in hand, to also uncover the original strongbox evidence against Silas Calloway, for what it had always been, planted, on Thorne's own order, by a company foreman who traded his testimony for leniency the moment he understood the full weight of evidence, now stacked against his employer. Elias Thorne lost the fur company within the year, lost his bid for Territorial Council before it had even properly begun, and left the territory entirely before the spring thaw, on a train nobody in Wolf Creek troubled themselves to see off. The foreman's confession, once it came, filled in the last of the story Wren had spent nearly a decade trying to piece together on her own. How Thorne had learned of Silas Calloway's quiet investigation weeks before her father ever gathered enough proof to act on it. How the strongbox had been planted under cover of a supposed routine inspection. How the whole affair had been orchestrated with the same careful, patient cruelty Thorne applied to every threat against his fortune. Hearing it laid out plainly, in a stranger's flat and unashamed testimony, gave Wren less satisfaction than she'd expected, and more grief. A fresh, sharp reminder of exactly how deliberately her father's life had been taken from him, and how very close his name had come to being lost to history entirely, buried under a dead trapper's silence, in a wall nobody but a loyal dog had ever thought to question. Wren did exactly what her father, and Amos Kettle both, had spent their final years too afraid to finish. Working alongside the Territorial Council's own investigators, she helped locate and compensate the trapping families Thorne had cheated across 2 decades, using what remained of the settlement, once every family had been paid, to establish a fair, independently audited trading post at Wolf Creek itself, one where no clerk would ever again have to choose between honest ledgers and his own safety. She had her father's name formally cleared before the Territorial Court that same winter, a small ceremony attended by no one from Thorne's Landing at all, though she found, to her surprise, that she no longer needed their presence to feel the weight of the injustice finally lift. She thought often, in the months that followed, of Amos Kettle himself, a man who had spent 20 years too frightened to speak, and who had died, in the end, having done the one small brave thing his fear still allowed him, choosing not to let the truth vanish with him, even if he could not carry it into the daylight himself. Wren had a modest marker placed at his unmarked grave that spring, engraved with nothing more than his name and a single line she copied, word for word, from the final page of his ledger. "I will not let the truth die with me," because it seemed to her the truest epitaph a frightened, guilty, ultimately decent man could have asked for, and because she understood, better than most, exactly how much courage it can take to simply refuse to let a wrong be forgotten, even when a person can't yet manage to right it themselves. She kept Amos Kettle's lodge too, repaired its roof and reset its leaning chimney across a long patient summer, and it became, in time, less a dead man's ruin, and more a kind of quiet monument to the courage it had taken him 20 years to almost find. Folks in Wolf Creek liked to say the widow's lodge, though Wren had never been anyone's widow, was the place where old Kettle's ghost had finally been let rest easy. Wren herself always corrected them gently. It was not any ghost resting easy, she'd say. It was a dog who wouldn't stop scratching at a wall everyone else had walked past for over a year, without once wondering what it was hiding. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in watching a truth buried for 20 years finally reach the daylight it was always owed, and we find ourselves drawn back to stories like Wren's again and again for exactly that reason. Not because justice delayed is ever truly justice on time, but because it still, in the end, matters enormously that it arrives at all. So we'll leave you with the same question Wren herself must have asked, kneeling before a stranger's hidden confession with her father's name finally within reach of clearing. If you found a hidden piece of history, something the world had buried, something with the power to finally right an old quiet wrong, would you keep it, or would you share it? Until next time, stay close.